Tonight, we're going to talk about a world that most of us have never really pictured, even though it's the foundation of nearly everything we now call civilization. You've probably heard the phrase before. Sumer, the first cities, the cradle of civilization. You've seen the ziggurats in textbooks, maybe a picture of a clay tablet with strange wedge-shaped marks on it, and you've been told, quite correctly, that this is where writing began. But here's what you probably haven't thought about. What did it actually feel like to wake up in one of those cities 5,000 years ago? What did the air smell like? What did people eat before they went to work? What did they argue about with their neighbors? What did they do when the sun went down and the oil lamps came out and there was still half an evening to fill? Because the truth is, the Sumerians spent very little of their lives building temples or inventing the wheel. Most of their days looked a lot more like ours than we tend to admit. They got up, they went to work, they complained about their bosses, they haggled at the market, they worried about their children, they got drunk on beer, and they went to bed. And the extraordinary thing, the almost unbelievable thing, is that we can actually reconstruct most of this in detail. Because these people, unlike any of their neighbors, decided to write it all down. On tablets that were then baked hard by the sun or accidentally preserved when their houses burned down and the fires fired the clay for us. Which means that today, 5 millennia later, we can still read the receipts, the letters, the school exercises, the marriage contracts, the beer recipes, and the complaint letters from a merchant named Nanny about the poor quality of copper he received. Yes, that exists. The oldest known written complaint in human history is a bad customer review. So forget the ziggurats for now. Forget Gilgamesh and the flood myths, at least for the moment. Let's talk about everything else. The daily and deeply human reality of the people who lived in the first cities the world had ever seen. Welcome to the channel, friends. Here we are back on another daily life video. I do hope you enjoy these as much as I do. Before we get into it, give it a quick like, comment, and subscribe. And if you're interested in joining the ranks of supporters that keep us ad and sponsor free, beholden only to our great audience, then you can check out the Patreon membership and merch store donation links in the pinned comment and description. Anyway, let's get straight to it. Well, first up, we better understand where we actually are. Because when people say Sumer, they often say it as if it's one place, one country, one people, and it really isn't. Sumer is a region, not a nation. It sits in the southern portion of what the Greeks would much later call Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. Those rivers being the Tigris and the Euphrates, which flow down from the mountains of what is now eastern Turkey, wind their way through modern Syria and Iraq, and eventually empty into the Persian Gulf. And it's in that southern floodplain, that hot, flat, muddy stretch of land near the Gulf, where something absolutely remarkable happened somewhere around 4000 to 3500 BCE. People started living together in numbers that had never been seen before on the planet. Not in villages, not in large villages, in cities, actual cities, places with tens of thousands of inhabitants, walled perimeters, temple complexes, administrative districts, and neighborhoods. And they did this thousands of years before the pyramids, thousands of years before the classical Greek world we talked about last time, thousands of years before pretty much anything you'd normally associate with ancient history. When Julius Caesar was walking around Rome, the ruins of Sumer were already older to him than he is to us. Just let that sit for a moment. Now, these cities had names you may have heard before. Uruk, the biggest of them all in the 4th millennium, possibly holding 40,000 to 80,000 people at its peak. Which most people know from the biblical reference to Abraham, but which was a thriving metropolis 1,000 years before Abraham was supposedly born. Then there was Eridu, considered by the Sumerians themselves to be the very first city, the place where kingship first descended from heaven. And Lagash, and Nippur, and Kish, and Umma, and a dozen others besides. Each one of these was its own political unit, with its own patron god, its own king or governor, its own laws, and its own often quite bitter rivalries with the neighbors. And this is important. Sumer was never a unified country in the way that we would think of one. It was a collection of city-states, competing, trading, marrying, and occasionally going to war with each other over water rights and border stones, which, if you think about it, is a very human way to organize yourselves. We haven't really changed that much. The Sumerians themselves called their land Kai-Engar, which roughly translates to the land of the noble lords, or perhaps the land of the civilized people. And they called themselves the black-headed people, Sag-Giggar, which was simply a description of their appearance in a region where they were the majority. They were not, however, alone. From very early on, another people were living alongside them in the same cities and towns, speaking a completely different language, a Semitic language ancestral to Akkadian, and later to Babylonian, Assyrian, and eventually Hebrew and Arabic. These two populations, the Sumerians and the early Semitic speakers, lived together, worked together, married each other, and gradually blended their cultures over centuries, which is another thing to keep in mind. Even the very first cities were multicultural. The pure Sumerian, if such a thing ever existed, is a scholarly fiction more than a historical reality. Now, we don't know exactly where the Sumerian language came from, and this is one of the enduring puzzles of the ancient world. It's what linguists call a language isolate. It's not related to any other known language, living or dead. It didn't come from anywhere we can trace, and when it eventually died out as a spoken tongue somewhere around 2000 BCE, it took its family tree with it. It survived only as a scholarly and religious language, a bit like Latin in medieval Europe, taught in schools and used in temples for another 1500 years or so, but no longer anyone's mother tongue, which is quite a fate for a language. Imagine English being spoken by absolutely nobody in 1,000 years, but being carefully preserved in universities and churches for its ancient prestige. That's what happened to Sumerian. But the reason we know so much about Sumerian daily life comes down to one absolutely game-changing invention: writing. And I know I said we'd focus on the everyday and not the famous inventions, but bear with me, because writing is precisely what lets us access the everyday. Without it, all we'd have is broken pottery and ruined foundations, and we'd be reduced to guessing what people were like, the way we have to guess about the people who came before Sumer. But the Sumerians left us their words, millions of them. Something in the region of 500,000 clay tablets have been recovered from the ancient Near East so far, and estimates suggest that many millions more are still sitting under the sand or in unexcavated ruins. The writing itself, which we now call cuneiform from the Latin cuneus meaning wedge, started off as pictures. Little drawings scratched into wet clay, showing a fish, an ox, a jar of beer, a foot, a head. It was originally invented not for poetry or history or even religious texts, but for accounting. That's right. The first thing anyone in history ever wrote down was a receipt. Somewhere in Uruk around 3200 BCE, a temple administrator needed to keep track of how many sheep had been delivered by which shepherd, and how many jars of grain had been distributed to which workers. And rather than trying to remember it all, he started scratching symbols onto flat pieces of clay. Over centuries, those pictures got simpler and more abstract, eventually turning into the wedge-shaped marks that give the script its name. And crucially, at some point, someone had the brilliant idea to use the symbols not just for the objects they depicted, but for the sounds those objects made when spoken aloud, which meant that suddenly you could write anything: names, verbs, grammar, poetry, complaints about copper, everything. The daily activity of writing was itself a physical craft, and if you were a scribe in Sumer, your working day involved a lot of clay under your fingernails. You take a fresh lump of soft river clay, shape it into a small flat rectangle roughly the size of a modern smartphone, though thicker and often more rounded, and then hold it in your left hand while you used a cut reed stylus in your right to press wedge-shaped marks into its surface. When you finished, you either let it dry in the sun for temporary records, or if it was really important, you baked it in a kiln, which is why so many of these tablets have survived. Clay is one of the most durable writing materials ever invented, ironically far more durable than the paper or the digital files we use today. There's a decent chance that in 5,000 years' time, the receipt from your last supermarket trip will have decayed into nothing, but the receipts from will still be sitting in the British Museum, perfectly legible. And here's the thing that always astonishes me. Learning to read and write cuneiform was extraordinarily difficult. There were hundreds of signs to memorize, some standing for whole words, some for syllables, some for both depending on context. Scribal school, called the Edaba, meaning tablet house, took years to complete, and we have the exercises from these schools. Actual homework tablets from actual Sumerian schoolboys, with the teacher's model text on one side and the student's shaky attempt on the other. We have their complaints about their teachers. We have their bragging about being better than the other students. We even have a story where a schoolboy invites his teacher home for dinner and his father wines and dines the teacher and gives him a fine gift so that the teacher will treat the boy more favorably at school. Written down 5,000 years ago. Some things really don't change, do they? Now, before we step into a Sumerian house and see what life actually looked like from the inside, we should talk about the physical setting these people lived in. Because the landscape shaped everything about how they organized their days. And it's a landscape that is genuinely alien to most of us, especially those of us who imagine ancient civilizations as taking place in some picturesque green valley or on some noble Mediterranean coast. Sumer was not picturesque. Sumer was hot, and I mean genuinely hot, with summer temperatures regularly climbing above 45 degrees Celsius, which for our American cousins is somewhere north of 110 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the sort of heat where the air itself feels thick and hostile, where the ground burns through the soles of your sandals, and where any exposed metal on your equipment becomes a genuine hazard to the touch. It was also, and this may surprise you given the rivers, remarkably dry. The southern Mesopotamian plain gets almost no rainfall to speak of. Everything grew in this land because of irrigation, not because of the sky. Which means that from the very beginning, Sumerian civilization was, at its heart, a hydraulic civilization entirely dependent on the network of canals, dikes, sluices, and reservoirs that its people had spent generations digging by hand to move water from the twin rivers out into the fields. And the fields were flat, astonishingly flat. If you stood on the roof of a Sumerian house and looked out across the countryside, you would see essentially no hills, no rolling terrain, no natural features to break up the horizon. Just an endless carpet of green fields, mud brick villages, canals reflecting the sky like ribbons of silver, and occasionally the tall silhouette of a distant ziggurat marking the location of another city. It was a landscape that human hands had almost entirely made. The soil was fertile beyond belief, so long as you kept the water flowing and managed the salt levels. This was a constant problem, and by the way, one that would eventually contribute to the collapse of southern Mesopotamian civilization thousands of years later. But in its glory days, in the 3rd millennium BCE, this floodplain produced grain in quantities that no other region on Earth could match. Barley yields in Sumer during a good year could reach ratios of 25 or 30 seeds harvested for every seed planted, which is a number that European farmers wouldn't reliably match until well into the early modern period. That's the agricultural surplus that made cities possible in the first place. You cannot have 30,000 people living in one place unless you have farmers producing far more food than they need for themselves. The rivers themselves were the beating heart of the whole operation, and they were unpredictable in ways that shaped the Sumerian religious imagination profoundly. Both the Tigris and the Euphrates flood in the spring, when snowmelt from the mountains up in what's now Turkey and Iran rushes down through the plains. But unlike the Nile, which floods with reassuring regularity and gentleness in late summer, just before the planting season begins, the Mesopotamian rivers flood in April and May, which is precisely when the crops are close to harvest. Which means that in a bad year, the floods can arrive early and destroy everything, or they can arrive late and leave you without enough water for the summer. Or they can be catastrophic and sweep away entire villages, drowning livestock and people alike. This is almost certainly the origin of the great flood myths that eventually made their way into the Bible via Babylonian intermediaries. The Sumerians had lived through actual devastating floods, and they wrote about them, and they built their theology around the idea that the gods might, on a whim, wipe you out entirely. It gave them, I think, a distinctive sensibility about the fragility of civilization. The idea that everything you had built could be washed away tomorrow was not a metaphor for these people. It was a practical possibility. Now, let's actually step inside one of these cities. Let's take Ur, since it's been excavated more thoroughly than most, largely thanks to Sir Leonard Woolley's incredible expeditions in the 1920s and 30s. If you approached Ur from the countryside during, say, the reign of Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE, the first thing you'd see from a distance would be the ziggurat rising above the plain. Not as tall as you might imagine from the illustrations, but genuinely impressive. A stepped pyramid of mud brick perhaps 30 meters high, painted in bands of color, with a small temple to the moon god Nana at its summit. Around the ziggurat, spreading out for hundreds of meters in every direction, was the temple complex proper, a walled precinct containing storerooms, kitchens, administrative offices, priests' quarters, and workshops where craftsmen produced goods for the temple. Beyond that, the city itself, surrounded by a thick mud brick wall pierced by gates, each gate typically named after a god or a direction. The wall wasn't as impressive as later fortifications you might picture, but it did the job. It kept out raiders, marked the sacred boundary of the city, and channeled traffic into predictable entry points where officials could tax the goods coming in and out. Passing through one of these gates, you'd immediately be struck by two things: the noise and the smell, and I don't say that in any judgmental way. A city of 30,000 people, most of whom kept animals, used chamber pots that were emptied into the streets, cooked on open fires, and worked in trades like tanning and dyeing that produced pungent byproducts, was going to smell strong regardless of how clean the inhabitants tried to be. The streets themselves were narrow, unpaved, winding, and often not much wider than a laden donkey. There was no grid plan, no urban design in the modern sense. Had grown organically over centuries, and the resulting street pattern was a labyrinth that only locals could navigate confidently. Foreigners regularly got lost, and when it rained, which admittedly wasn't often, the streets turned into channels of thick mud that dried into ruts and ridges that could last for weeks. But for most of the year, the streets were dusty, hot, and crowded. You'd see people carrying jars of water on their heads from the public wells, donkeys laden with sacks of grain heading toward the granaries, priests in their long, fringed robes moving between the temple and the shrines in private homes, and children running everywhere, doing all the things children have always done in cities, which is to say making a great deal of noise and generally being underfoot. The houses themselves are what really interest me, because they give us the clearest window into how ordinary Sumerians actually lived. And the Sumerian house is, honestly, one of the most sensible domestic designs anyone has ever come up with for that climate. Picture a rectangular building of unbaked mud brick, 1 or sometimes 2 stories tall, with a completely blank exterior wall facing the street. No windows on the ground floor, at least not on the street side. Just a single wooden door, often quite small, leading into a narrow entrance passage. This design was not accidental. It kept the interior cool by blocking the sun, it protected the family from the noise and smell and prying eyes of the street, and it made the house harder to break into. Once you passed through the entrance passage, though, everything changed, because the Sumerian house was built around a central open-air courtyard, which was the heart of family life. All the rooms of the house opened onto this courtyard, which meant that when you were inside, you were actually still outdoors in a sense, but shielded from the street. The courtyard typically had a well or a cistern, sometimes a small altar for household worship, often a cooking area, and if the family was reasonably prosperous, some potted plants or even a small tree for shade. Around it were arranged the various rooms of the house, a reception room where guests were entertained, a kitchen with a bread oven called a tinuru, which is the direct ancestor of the modern tandoor still used across the Middle East and South Asia. Bedrooms, which were often small and sparse, containing little more than a bed frame, some woven mats, and a chest for clothing and valuables. A bathroom, which many Sumerian houses genuinely did have, complete with a drainage system that carried waste water out to the street or, in the better neighborhoods, to a proper sewage system beneath the road. A workshop or storage room, depending on the family's trade, and a small shrine where the household gods were honored daily. The really wealthy families had houses with a second story, reached by a wooden staircase, containing additional bedrooms and often a private family chapel. The roof was flat, made of packed earth over wooden beams and reed matting, and in the summer months, This is where the family actually slept, because the interior of the house, however cool, could not compete with the open air of the roof once the sun went down. Picture entire neighborhoods where, after dark, everyone climbed up to their rooftops and laid out sleeping mats under the stars, calling greetings to their neighbors across the narrow gaps between houses. That's how the Sumerians dealt with the summer heat. It's how much of the traditional Middle East still deals with it, honestly. Some solutions to climate problems really don't need improving. Now, the poor didn't live like this, and it's important to be honest about that. The urban poor of Sumer lived in much smaller houses, sometimes just one or two rooms clustered around a shared courtyard that they might share with several other families. Slaves, of whom there were plenty in every Sumerian city, either lived in their masters' households in whatever corner was available, or in barrack-style accommodation attached to temples and palaces. And there were undoubtedly people who lived in nothing more than reed shelters against the city wall or in the leftover spaces between larger buildings, though these traces are much harder for archaeologists to find because they leave so little behind. Sumer was not an egalitarian society, and the physical layout of the city reflected that. The best neighborhoods were near the temple, in the shade of the ziggurat, close to the wells and the market squares. The worst were pressed against the outer walls, in the low ground where drainage was poor and disease more common. Furniture, by the way, was minimal by our standards. The Sumerians sat and slept on floor cushions and low platforms rather than on chairs and beds in the modern sense. They did have chairs, though, beautiful ones if you were rich. Carved wooden chairs with legs shaped like the paws of lions or the hooves of oxen, sometimes inlaid with mother of pearl or lapis lazuli, or fine strips of bone and shell. The famous royal tombs of Ur, which Woolley excavated in the 1920s and which produced some of the most spectacular grave goods ever recovered from the ancient world, included chairs and a magnificent throne belonging to Queen Puabi, whose remains were found surrounded by the bodies of her attendants, all apparently poisoned or drugged and buried with her so they could serve her in the afterlife. Which is a chilling reminder that however domestic and familiar Sumerian life can look on the surface, the underlying assumptions about the world were profoundly different from our own. But for ordinary people, furniture meant a low table, some wooden stools, a chest or two, and reed mats on the floor. That was it. And it worked perfectly well for a lifestyle where most activities happened at ground level any. Now let's talk about what these people actually ate, because food is one of the areas where we have almost embarrassingly detailed information, thanks again to those clay tablets. The Sumerians were, above all else, barley eaters. Barley was the foundation of their diet in the way that rice is for East Asia or maize for the pre-Columbian Americas. It grew well in the somewhat saline soil of southern Mesopotamia. It stored well in the granaries, and it could be processed into a remarkable variety of foods. The most basic was bread, made from coarsely ground barley flour mixed with water and sometimes a bit of sesame oil, then baked on the hot walls of the tinuru oven until it puffed up into a flatbread that could be torn apart and used to scoop up other foods. This bread, which the Sumerians called ninda, was eaten at every meal by every social class from the king to the poorest laborer. The differences were in the quality of the flour and the additions. The rich ate bread made from finely sifted flour, sometimes with honey or dates mixed in. The poor ate bread that was gritty with husks and sometimes stretched with the addition of other grains or even legumes when the barley ran short. Beyond bread, the Sumerian diet included a lot of porridge, made by boiling coarsely cracked barley in water until it softened into a thick gruel. This was often flavored with dates, which grew abundantly on the date palms that lined every irrigation canal and were one of the most important crops of the region. Dates, in fact, were nearly as central to Sumerian life as barley. The date palm was called the tree of life, and every part of it was used. The fruit was eaten fresh or dried, or pressed into a thick syrup that served as the primary sweetener before the widespread availability of honey. The leaves were woven into mats and baskets. The trunks were used for beams in construction, and the sap could be fermented into a mildly alcoholic drink called palm wine. A well-maintained date palm could produce for over 100 years, making it a genuine multi-generational investment. Grandparents planted them for grandchildren. Meat was less common than you might expect. The Sumerians certainly kept and ate sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs, and they raised ducks and geese. But meat was expensive and reserved mostly for feast days, religious occasions, and the tables of the wealthy. For ordinary people, meat appeared on the menu perhaps once a week if they were doing well, and mostly in the form of small amounts of mutton or goat cooked into stews with vegetables and served over grain. What was much more common as a source of protein was fish. Because remember, this was a civilization built on rivers, canals, and marshes, and the waters of southern Mesopotamia teemed with fish of dozens of varieties. Fresh fish, salted fish, dried fish, fish sauces of the kind that would later become famous in the Roman world as garum, and even the extremely popular fish paste that could be smeared on bread or mixed into other dishes. Archaeological excavations at Sumerian sites regularly turn up huge deposits of fish bones from ordinary household refuse, showing that fish was the everyday protein of the working population. Vegetables and legumes rounded out the diet. Onions, garlic, leeks, cucumbers, lettuce of a bitter variety quite different from what we eat today, chickpeas, lentils, and various beans. There were no potatoes, no tomatoes, no eggplants, no citrus fruits, and none of the peppers or chilies that would only reach the Old World thousands of years later after the Columbian Exchange. So the flavor palette of a Sumerian meal is genuinely different from anything most of us have eaten. Imagine a stew of mutton with onions, garlic, leeks, and lentils, seasoned with cumin, coriander, mustard seeds, and a bit of vinegar, served over barley porridge with a piece of flatbread on the side, followed by a handful of dates and a cup of beer. That's a pretty typical dinner for a moderately prosperous Sumerian family. It sounds, honestly, quite nice, and it's a diet that would still make dietary sense today. Ah, but I mentioned beer, and we can't move on without talking about it properly, because beer was central to Sumerian civilization in a way that's genuinely hard to overstate. The Sumerians drank beer at breakfast, at lunch, at dinner, at religious ceremonies, at business meetings, at funerals, at weddings, and pretty much anytime a cup was empty and needed filling. They had a specific goddess of beer, Ninkasi, and one of the oldest surviving pieces of Sumerian literature is a hymn to her that also serves as a functional recipe for brewing. Modern craft brewers have actually reconstructed Sumerian beer using this hymn, and the results are apparently something like a thick, slightly sour, mildly alcoholic drink with grains and dates, and sometimes herbs still floating in it. It was drunk through long straws, often communally from a single large jar, with each drinker having their own straw and dipping in for a sip. This is one of the most consistently depicted scenes in Sumerian art. Two or more people sitting facing each other with a beer jar between them, straws going in from opposite sides, one hand often gesturing in conversation. It's the ancient Mesopotamian equivalent of two friends sharing a drink at the pub, and it happened constantly. Workers on major building projects were paid in beer rations along with their bread. The daily ration for an ordinary laborer was about 2 liters, and for a supervisor or skilled craftsman, up to 4 or even 5 liters a day. Now, before you imagine an entire civilization staggering around perpetually drunk, remember that Sumerian beer was much less alcoholic than modern beers. Perhaps 2 or 3% alcohol at most, sometimes even less. It was more like a nutritional beverage than a proper intoxicant. In a region where drinking water was often of dubious quality, thanks to shared canals and general contamination, the mild alcohol content of beer made it safer than water for daily drinking, which is why it was consumed by everyone, including children, though children got a weaker version. It provided calories, hydration, and some vitamins from the fermentation process. It was, honestly, one of the great public health innovations of the ancient world, whether the Sumerians thought of it that way or not. Wine, incidentally, did exist, but was much more expensive and rarer than beer. Grapes did not grow well in the southern Mesopotamian climate, and wine had to be imported from the highland regions to the north and east. This made it a luxury drink for the wealthy and for religious ceremonies. Most Sumerians drank beer, and most Sumerians drank a lot of it. Now, having discussed the setting and the food, let's actually walk through what a day looked like for a Sumerian family. And let's take, as our example, a middle-class household in around 2000 BCE. The head of the household is a merchant named Lu-Enlil, which means man of the god Enlil. He's about 40 years old, married to a woman named Nana, meaning servant of the god Nana. They have 3 surviving children, though they've buried 2 others in the family plot beneath the house, which was the standard Sumerian practice for infant burial. The oldest son, Erningirsu, is 15 and is being trained as a scribe. The daughter, Nintud, is 12 and helping her mother manage the household. And the youngest son, Enanatum, is 7 and is still mostly just being a child. This family isn't rich, but they're comfortable. They own their 2-story house near the central market. They have 3 household slaves, and Lu-Enlil owns a small share in several trading ventures that send goods up and down the Persian Gulf. The day begins well before dawn. In fact, the Sumerians divided their day into 12 daylight hours and 12 nighttime hours, and the length of these hours changed with the seasons. In summer, when we're setting our scene, daylight hours were long and hot, and people rose extremely early to get the important work done before the heat became intolerable. Lu-Enlil wakes as the sky is beginning to turn grey in the east, before the sun has actually crested the horizon. He climbs down from the roof, where the family has been sleeping to escape the summer heat, and heads into the courtyard where a household slave has already lit a small fire in the cooking area. The morning routine is quick. He washes his face and hands in a basin of water drawn from the cistern, using a mixture of ash and oil as a kind of primitive soap. He rubs a small amount of sesame oil into his hair and beard, which serves both to keep them neat and to protect them from the drying effect of the sun. He puts on his outer robe, called a naham, which for a merchant of his standing is made of good white linen with a fringed hem in a subtle pattern, and he wraps a woven sash around his waist. Breakfast is simple but substantial. A bowl of barley porridge sweetened with date syrup, a few pieces of yesterday's bread torn up and dipped in olive oil imported from the north, a handful of dried figs, and a cup of beer to wash it all down. The children come down from the roof one by one, blinking in the morning light, and take their places on the mats around the low table. Nana, the mother, sits across from her husband and directs the household slave who is serving the meal. Conversation is quiet at breakfast. Sumerian etiquette held that noisy morning conversation was rude and that important matters should be discussed later in the day. This is, if you think about it, a piece of practical wisdom that many of us could still benefit from. Let people wake up before you start arguing with them. After breakfast, Lu-Enlil kisses his wife on the forehead, gives brief instructions to the servants, and heads out into the street. His destination is the small shrine at the corner of the marketplace, where he stops, as he does every morning, to make an offering to his personal god. Every Sumerian had a personal god, a kind of divine patron who watched over the individual and interceded with the great gods on their behalf. This is genuinely important to understand because it shapes how the Sumerians thought about their relationship with the sacred. They did not generally pray directly to the great gods like Enlil or Anu or Inanna. Those were far too grand, too distant, too dangerous. Instead, they prayed to their personal god, who would then bring their concerns to the attention of the greater powers. It's a bit like how in a modern bureaucracy you don't try to email the CEO directly. You go through your manager, who goes through their manager, and so on up the chain. The Sumerian religious system was remarkably similar in its structure. Lu-Enlil's personal god is, unsurprisingly, given his name. Enlil, though in a smaller and more accessible aspect than the terrifying storm god who ruled the divine assembly. He places a small piece of bread on the shrine, pours a few drops of beer into a shallow dish, and murmurs a brief prayer asking for success in the day's business and protection for his family. Then he continues on his way, joining the growing stream of people heading toward the marketplace and the docks. It's now perhaps an hour after dawn, and the city is fully awake. Bakers are pulling the first bread of the day out of their ovens, filling the streets with a smell that even now, 5,000 years later, would be immediately recognizable to any of us. Water carriers are hauling their jars from the wells. Priests are making their way to the temple for the morning rituals. Farmers who live in the city but work fields outside the walls are heading out through the gates with their tools over their shoulders. And beggars, of whom every ancient city had many, are taking up their positions at the street corners with their bowls held out. The marketplace of called the Karam, was one of the busiest commercial hubs in the ancient world. It sat near the river dock, where the trading ships from downriver and upriver unloaded their cargoes onto the quays. On any given morning, you would see barges from the northern cities bringing timber, stone, copper, and wine. Ocean-going ships from the Persian Gulf bringing pearls, ivory, exotic hardwoods, and even the occasional shipment of items from as far away as the Indus Valley in what is now Pakistan. Because yes, the Sumerians had direct maritime trade contacts with the Harappan civilization over 2,000 kilometers away, and archaeologists have found Harappan seals and beads in Sumerian sites and Sumerian artifacts in Harappan sites. This is genuine long-distance intercontinental trade in the 3rd millennium BCE, and it is one of the most underappreciated facts of ancient history. The market itself is not a single building, but a sprawling network of stalls, workshops, and open squares that spreads across several city blocks. Different sections specialize in different goods. The grain market is over here, where farmers and wholesalers negotiate the price of barley by the gur, a unit of about 300 liters. The livestock market is over there, where sheep, goats, cattle, and occasionally donkeys change hands amid a great deal of shouting and bargaining. The metalworkers have their own street, where the constant ringing of hammers on copper and bronze creates a sound that can be heard from blocks away. The pottery market, the textile market, the perfumers and spice sellers, the baker's row, the fish market, positioned strategically downwind of everything else. Each section has its own smells, its own sounds, its own customary way of doing business. Lu Enlil's business today involves meeting with a ship captain who has just returned from a voyage down the Persian Gulf to the land the Sumerians called Dilmun, which is modern Bahrain. Dilmun was one of the great trading intermediaries of the ancient world, sitting on the sea route between Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley, and its merchants dealt in copper, timber, semi-precious stones, and various luxury goods. Lu Enlil holds a share in this ship's cargo, having invested 20 shekels of silver in the voyage some months ago, and he wants to see what his return will be. The meeting takes place at a small tavern near the docks, over cups of beer and platters of grilled fish. The captain, a burly, weather-beaten man named Ilambani, unrolls a scroll of accounts and goes through the manifest item by item. So many mina of copper, so many logs of imported cedar, a small quantity of pearls of medium quality, some carnelian beads from the eastern lands, and so on. Lu Enlil listens carefully, occasionally asking questions, mentally calculating what his share will come to. The negotiations are civil but not warm. This is business. This kind of scene, incidentally, is not speculation on my part. We have actual documents from Sumerian and later Old Babylonian traders that show exactly this sort of transaction. Contracts written in cuneiform on clay tablets, listing the investors, the ship's captain, the destination, the goods, the expected profits, and the divisions of any losses. We even have letters between merchants and their business partners complaining about bad deals, disputed shipments, and delayed payments. The famous complaint tablet of Nani to Inasia, which I mentioned earlier, dates from about 1750 BCE and reads in part like a modern one-star review. Nani had ordered a shipment of copper ingots from Inasia, and when the copper arrived, it was of inferior quality. Nani's tablet is a masterpiece of aggrieved indignation. He complains that Inasia has treated him with contempt, has sent him bad ore, has kept his money, and has generally behaved dishonorably. What makes this tablet so wonderful is that archaeologists found it, along with several other complaint letters from other dissatisfied customers, in Inasia's own house. He kept them. Whether he kept them as records of disputes, or because he intended to respond to them, or because he simply couldn't bear to throw away someone else's angry letter, we'll never know. But the fact that he kept them, and that the house eventually collapsed and preserved them, means that 4,000 years later, we can read these ordinary business complaints and recognize every single emotion in them. Nani's rage is our rage. Inasia's suspected indifference is the indifference of every customer service department any of us has ever dealt with. Nothing changes. Now, while Lu Enlil is conducting his business at the docks, let's look in on Jeem Nana, his wife, back at the house. Because the world of the Sumerian woman deserves its own attention, and it's a more complex and interesting one than modern stereotypes about ancient patriarchies might lead you to expect. Sumerian women did not have the same legal and social status as men, that much is true. Their public lives were more constrained. Their opportunities for high office were limited. But within the domestic sphere, and even in the broader economy, Sumerian women had considerably more agency and legal protection than women in many later ancient societies. They could own property. They could conduct business in their own names. They could inherit and bequeath wealth. They could initiate divorce proceedings, though the grounds available to a wife were more restricted than those available to a husband. They could serve as priestesses in the temple system, and some of the most powerful religious offices in Sumer were held by women. The high priestess of the moon god at called the Entu, was typically the daughter of the king, and she wielded enormous religious and political influence. The earliest named author in world history, whose writings we still have, was a Sumerian woman. Her name was Enheduanna, and she was the high priestess of the moon god at around 2300 BCE, appointed to that role by her father Sargon of Akkad. Her hymns to the goddess Inanna have survived and are considered some of the finest religious poetry produced in the ancient world. So when we imagine Jeem Nana, we should not imagine a silent shadow in the background of her husband's life. She's the manager of a substantial household. She keeps the accounts of household expenditure, which she does on wax tablets, since she's literate enough for that even if she never went to the formal scribal school. She supervises 3 household slaves and directs their daily work. She oversees the education of her daughter and the moral upbringing of her sons. She maintains the household shrine to the family's personal gods and conducts the daily domestic religious observances. She manages the family's stores of grain, oil, textiles, and other goods, and she makes the decisions about what to purchase at the market and when. She entertains other women in the reception room of the house, discussing family news, arranging marriages between children of allied families, and negotiating the endless small social transactions that hold a community together. And she does all this with an authority that her husband does not question, because the domestic realm is understood to be hers. This morning, her main task is supervising the preparation of textiles, because textile production was one of the great engines of the Sumerian economy, and much of it happened within private households under the direction of the woman of the house. Wool from the family's own sheep, kept on a small farm outside the walls that Lu Enlil owns as a side investment, has been brought in by one of the servants and now needs to be cleaned, carded, spun into thread, and eventually woven into cloth. Some of this cloth will be used by the family. Some will be sold at the market. And some, if Jeem Nana is particularly ambitious about it, will be traded as export goods to be carried on merchant ships to the northern cities, where southern Mesopotamian textiles were highly valued. The women of produced textiles of a quality and variety that made them famous throughout the ancient Near East, and this production was largely in the hands of the female heads of household who coordinated the labor of servants, slaves, and daughters into what was essentially a cottage industry embedded in every home. Jeem Nana spends the morning in the courtyard with her daughter Nintad and 2 of the household slaves. They sit on woven mats in the shade of the second-story overhang, and the work proceeds with the rhythm of long practice. One slave cards the raw wool, teasing out the fibers with a pair of wooden combs. Nintad, who is 12 and has been doing this since she was 6, spins the carded wool into thread using a drop spindle, that ingenious little device consisting of a weighted stick that hangs from the thread and rotates as it drops, twisting the fibers together as it descends. She's fast at it now, and her thread is even and strong. Jeem Nana herself works on a small horizontal loom set up in the courtyard, weaving a piece of fine cloth intended for a new robe for her husband. The pattern she's working on is complex, involving colored threads dyed in red and blue and yellow, and it requires her full attention. The conversation among them, when there is any, is quiet and practical. Instructions about the work, comments about the weather, a brief exchange about what should be prepared for the midday meal. The children of the household are, at this point, dispersed. The oldest son, Erningersu, left before dawn for the scribal school, the Edaba, where he has been enrolled for the past 6 years and will remain for perhaps another 2 or 3 years before completing his education. And the scribal school deserves its own detailed discussion, because it was one of the most distinctive institutions of Sumerian civilization and one of the most important, because it produced the small literate class that made everything else possible. The Edaba was typically a private establishment run by a master scribe called the Amir, meaning something like expert or professor. It might operate out of the master's own home, in a courtyard set aside for teaching, or in a purpose-built school attached to a temple. Students, who were called Dumuedaba, sons of the tablet house, came from families wealthy enough to afford the fees and to spare their sons from other productive labor during the long years of their education. The school day was long and hard. Students arrived at dawn, worked essentially without a break until noon, took a short midday meal, and then continued through the afternoon until sunset. 6 days a week, with, if the surviving school texts are to be believed, occasional beatings for those who fell behind or misbehaved. We have actual documents describing the daily life of a schoolboy in verse form, essentially a first-person narrative of a bad day at school, where the boy is beaten by the doorkeeper for coming late, by the teacher for having sloppy handwriting, by the assistant teacher for talking, by the yard monitor for standing up without permission, and by various other officials for various other infractions. The narrative continues with the boy's father inviting the teacher home for a fine meal to smooth things over, and the teacher then praising the boy the next day. It's a fictional composition intended partly as a warning to students and partly as a satire on the school system. But the underlying reality it describes is quite consistent with what we know from other sources. Sumerian schooling was strict, demanding, and physically enforced. What the students actually learned was cuneiform writing and everything that came with it. The basic curriculum began with the shapes of the individual signs, which had to be memorized in enormous numbers, first by copying them over and over on practice tablets, then by combining them into words and phrases, and eventually by writing out whole texts from dictation and from memory. Students copied lists of standard vocabulary, categorized by topic. Lists of trees, lists of stones, lists of animals, lists of professions, lists of gods, lists of geographic features. These lexical lists, which the Sumerians called Ana Atishu, were the foundation of scribal knowledge and were used throughout the Near East for over 2,000 years. They copied literary texts too. Hymns to the gods, myths of creation, epics of ancient kings, proverbs and wisdom sayings, and increasingly complex mathematical problems. Because a Sumerian scribe was not just someone who could write. He was expected to be a competent mathematician, an accountant, a legal draftsman, a poet if the occasion required it, and a walking encyclopedia of religious and administrative knowledge. It was the closest thing the ancient world had to a comprehensive liberal education, and it took 10 years to complete for those who went all the way through. Erningersu is now in what would be roughly the middle of his education. He's mastered the basic signs. He can read and write everyday administrative documents, and he's currently working on his mathematics. Sumerian mathematics, incidentally, was extraordinary and included concepts that would not appear in Western Europe until well over 3,000 years later. They used a sexagesimal system based on the number 60, which is why we still divide our hours into 60 minutes, and our minutes into 60 seconds, and our circles into 360 degrees. That's a direct inheritance from Sumer, still shaping how you check the time on your watch today. They could calculate the areas of complex geometric figures. They understood something equivalent to the Pythagorean theorem more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras, and they had developed sophisticated methods for solving what we would now call quadratic equations. Erningersu is currently struggling with problems involving the calculation of the volume of a granary of irregular shape, and he's finding it difficult. But his teacher tells him that if he masters this, He'll be able to find employment with the temple as an administrator, which is a respectable and comfortable career. Meanwhile, the youngest son, Enanatum, who is only 7, is not yet in formal schooling. He's spending his morning at a neighbor's house, playing with the neighbor's boy who is the same age, under the loose supervision of the neighbor's servants. Sumerian children, when they were not working or being educated, played with toys that would be entirely recognizable to modern children. Archaeologists have found little clay figures of animals, small wheeled carts that could be pulled by string, dolls made of clay or wood, dice, board games, balls, and rattles. There's a wonderful collection of children's toys from the royal tombs of Ur, including a delightful little gaming board known as the Royal Game of Ur, which was played with dice and pieces, and which we have actually reconstructed the rules of, thanks to a tablet found in Babylon that explains how to play. Modern people have played the reconstructed game, and it turns out to be genuinely fun, which is a remarkable connection to the leisure hours of people who lived 5,000 years ago. Enanatum and his friend spend the morning playing with a set of small clay animals, arranging them into pretend flocks and having elaborate dramas involving the shepherd protecting his sheep from lions. They also have a wooden top that spins impressively when you wind a string around it and pull. And they play a chasing game around the courtyard that seems to be the ancient equivalent of tag. Their laughter and shouting drift up over the walls of the neighbor's house and mingle with all the other sounds of a Sumerian residential neighborhood. Voices calling from window to window, a donkey braying in a nearby stable, a woman singing as she grinds grain at a rotary quern, the distant clang of the coppersmiths at their forges. And from somewhere in the direction of the temple, the deep resonant sound of a drum being struck, marking one of the hourly ritual observances. The morning wears on toward midday, and the heat begins to build in earnest. By mid-morning, the streets are noticeably emptier than they were at dawn, as people take shelter in courtyards and interior rooms. This is the great daily rhythm of life in a hot climate, one that Mediterranean and Middle Eastern cultures have maintained essentially unchanged for thousands of years. You do your important work early. You retreat indoors for the middle of the day. You emerge again in the late afternoon and evening. The concept of the siesta, that midday rest that Northern Europeans and Americans sometimes find puzzling or even mildly reprehensible, is not a modern Spanish invention. It's the sensible ancient response to a climate where working through the hottest hours of the day is a good way to make yourself ill. The Sumerians did exactly this. They had a name for the midday rest and social conventions around it, and it was understood that between roughly the 5th and 8th hours of daylight, in the peak of summer, the city essentially slowed down to a crawl. Lu Enlil, having finished his business at the docks and made arrangements for his share of the trading profits to be delivered to his house in the form of silver ingots, is now walking back through the increasingly quiet streets. His route takes him past the temple precinct, and he pauses briefly to watch a procession of priests carrying an offering of grain into the outer courtyard. The temple, and the whole religious world it represented, was the invisible framework around which every Sumerian day was organized, and we need to spend some time understanding it, because without the temple you cannot really understand Sumer at all. The great temple complex of any Sumerian city was not simply a place of worship in the way that a modern church or mosque or synagogue is. It was the largest landowner in the city, sometimes controlling more agricultural land than all the private owners put together. It was the largest employer, with thousands of workers on its payroll ranging from priests and scribes down to weavers and bakers and shepherds. It was the largest bank, storing grain in its granaries as a hedge against famine and lending out silver and copper at interest to merchants and farmers alike. It was the largest school, training the scribes and administrators who kept the whole civilization running. It was the center of administrative law, where contracts were witnessed and disputes were mediated. And of course, it was also the residence of the god who owned the city, because that's the crucial theological point that we modern readers often miss. Each Sumerian city belonged, quite literally, to a particular god. Ur belonged to Nana, the moon god. Uruk belonged to An, the sky god, and to his granddaughter Inanna, the goddess of love and war. Nippur belonged to Enlil, the storm god who was the effective head of the divine assembly. Eridu belonged to Enki, the god of fresh water and wisdom. Lagash belonged to Ningirsu, a warrior god, and so on. These gods were not distant abstract beings. They were understood to reside in the temple, in the innermost sanctuary, in the form of a cult statue that was treated in every important respect as if it were the god himself. The statue was washed every morning, dressed in fine clothing, offered food and drink at set hours of the day, entertained with music and dance, and put to bed at night. It was, in the most literal sense, the divine householder whose city was his personal estate. And the priests of the temple were his household staff, and the ordinary citizens of the city were his tenants, workers, and clients. This shaped the psychology of Sumerian religion in a very particular way. The gods were not benevolent friends or moral judges in the modern sense. They were powerful landowners whose favor you needed and whose displeasure you feared. If crops failed, if disease struck, if invasion loomed, the assumption was that the god was angry, and the appropriate response was to figure out what had offended him and to make amends. Sometimes this was easy. You'd neglected the regular offerings. Sometimes it was harder. You committed some sin without knowing it, or you'd been the victim of a curse, or an evil demon had attached itself to you. In these cases, you consulted specialists. The Sumerian world was full of ritual experts of various kinds. There was the Ashipu, the exorcist or magical practitioner, who could diagnose spiritual afflictions and prescribe rituals to remove them. There was the Baru, the diviner, who could read the future through the examination of the livers of sacrificial sheep, or through observing the behavior of oil poured on water, or through interpreting dreams. There was the Kalu, the lamentation priest, whose specialty was performing elaborate ritual mourning to soothe an angry god. And there were the regular priests, the Sangu, who managed the daily operations of the temple. The ordinary Sumerian's religious life, though, was mostly private and domestic. Great festivals happened a few times a year, and everyone participated in those, joining the processions, watching the sacred marriage rites in which the king ritually became the husband of the goddess Inanna, feasting on the meat of sacrificial animals distributed by the temple. But day to day, religion happened at the household shrine. Every home had one. A small alcove or corner where images of the family's personal gods were kept, along with images of the household ancestors, whose spirits were believed to remain present in the family and to require offerings of food and drink to keep them content. Every morning, the woman of the house or a designated servant would make small offerings at this shrine: a piece of bread, a splash of beer, a few drops of oil. Every meal was preceded by a brief acknowledgement of the gods and ancestors. And every important family event, from births to marriages to burials, involved elaborate rituals conducted in the home. Lu Enlil arrives home around midday to find the household in the quieter rhythm of the hot hours. Jeem Nana has laid out the midday meal on a low table in the courtyard, in the deepest shade available. Today's meal is a stew of lamb with onions, garlic, and lentils, served with fresh bread, some sliced cucumbers, and a bowl of cheese made from goat's milk that a servant purchased from a farmer at the market this morning. There's date wine to drink, which is a change from the usual beer, in honor of Lu Enlil's successful morning of business. The family eats together, the parents and the daughter and the youngest son. Erningersu is not present. He is still at the scribal school, where the students eat their midday meal on the premises and then continue their lessons through the afternoon. Over the meal, Lu Enlil tells his wife about the trading venture and the returns he expects. Jeem Nana, who has been managing the household accounts for years, immediately begins mentally calculating how much of this can go into savings, how much needs to be reinvested in the next voyage, and how much can be set aside for the daughter's dowry, which they will need to start assembling in earnest within a few years. Nin Tud, the daughter, listens quietly. She's 12, which by Sumerian standards is nearly of marriageable age. Sumerian girls were typically married between 14 and 16, though sometimes younger among the wealthy for reasons of political alliance. Lu Enlil and Jeem Nana have already begun preliminary discussions with several families whose sons might be suitable matches. The eventual marriage will be a contractual affair, negotiated between the families, with a formal dowry provided by Nintud's parents and a formal marriage gift, called the Terhatum, provided by the groom's family to the bride's parents. The contract will be written down on a clay tablet, witnessed by both families and by professional witnesses, and kept as a legal record. Nintud has opinions about all this, and in a Sumerian household, these opinions were taken seriously, though ultimately the parents made the decision. She has met, at various family gatherings, the son of a wealthy jeweler on the other side of the city, and she thinks he seems reasonable enough. She has also met the son of a temple administrator, whom she finds pompous. Her mother has taken careful note of these preferences, though she has not yet discussed them formally with her husband. There will be time for that. For the moment, Nintud is happy to eat her lunch and think about the afternoon, when she and her mother will visit the household of a family friend to attend a small gathering of women who are planning the details of an upcoming wedding. After lunch, the household enters what we might call the rest period. Lu Enlil retreats to a small side room where he has a rope-strung bed frame with a stuffed mattress, and he lies down for what he expects will be a 2-hour nap. Jim Nana does the same in the master bedroom. The servants take their own rest in the smaller rooms at the back of the house, though they will be up before their masters to prepare for the afternoon's activities. Nintud lies on a mat in the courtyard and reads. Yes, reads. Because Sumerian upper-class girls, though not usually sent to the formal scribal school, were often taught the basics of reading and writing at home, and Nintud has been learning her signs from her older brother for years. What she's reading is a collection of proverbs, a genre the Sumerians produced in great volume and which their students used as reading practice. Sumerian proverbs are a delightful window into the culture. They range from the practical to the philosophical to the wonderfully cynical. Do not marry a prostitute whose lovers are numerous. One of them advises. Wealth is far away, poverty is at hand, says another. He who possesses much silver may be happy, he who possesses much barley may be happy, but he who has nothing at all can sleep. That last one is a personal favorite of mine, and it shows the kind of dry humor that runs through much of Sumerian literature. Little Enanatum, meanwhile, is asleep in the corner of the courtyard, having exhausted himself with his morning of play. He'll be up in an hour or two, ready to demand attention and food. The city outside is now essentially silent. The streets are empty. The market has closed for the afternoon. The dock workers have retreated to their homes or to shaded corners along the wharves. Even the animals seem to have paused. Only the priests in the great temple continue their work, because the god must be served regardless of the heat, and the afternoon offerings must be made on their proper schedule. The sound of a temple gong occasionally drifts across the rooftops, marking the passage of another sacred hour. And the sun beats down on the mud brick walls with an intensity that would be unbearable if you weren't accustomed to it. Around the middle of the afternoon, as the worst of the heat begins to break, the city gradually starts to stir again. Servants come out of their rest and begin preparing for the evening's activities. Water is drawn from the wells and cisterns. Fires that had been damped down for the midday are stoked up again in preparation for the evening meal, and people begin to emerge from their houses, blinking in the still strong afternoon light, ready to resume the business of the day. Lu Enlil wakes from his nap and stretches, feeling refreshed. He splashes water on his face, changes his robe for a lighter one suitable for a social afternoon, and prepares to head out again. His plan for the afternoon is to visit one of the taverns near the market, where he has business associates who like to meet in the late afternoon over cups of beer to discuss commercial affairs and to share the day's news. Now this is worth pausing on, because the tavern was one of the great institutions of Sumerian social life, and one that has been unfairly neglected in most popular histories of the region. Sumerian taverns, called Eshdam or sometimes Bitsakari, were run overwhelmingly by women, and they were centers of commerce, gossip, entertainment, and drink in a way that has an almost startling similarity to the neighborhood pubs of much later European cultures. The tavern keeper, invariably a woman, brewed her own beer on the premises, kept a stock of prepared food, and provided a space where people could gather, talk, do business, and generally socialize outside the confines of their homes. The Sumerian legal codes, of which the most famous and complete is the Code of Hammurabi from a slightly later Babylonian period, contained detailed regulations about tavern keepers. The prices they could charge, the quality of beer they had to serve, their responsibility for the behavior of their customers, and their obligation to report anyone plotting against the king or the state who might be conspiring in their establishments. The tavern keeper was, in effect, licensed and regulated, and she had legal responsibilities that went beyond simply serving drinks. She was expected to be a source of intelligence for the authorities, an enforcer of certain moral standards, and a witness to commercial transactions. This last point is important. Many Sumerian business deals were sealed over drinks at a tavern, with the tavern keeper serving as an official witness whose testimony could be called upon later if there was a dispute. She was, in a very real sense, a small businesswoman with significant social standing in her neighborhood. The tavern Luenlil is heading to is called something like the Sign of the Fish, though the name in Sumerian would be more elaborate and involve a religious reference to Enki, the god of fresh water, and by extension of fish and fishermen. It's run by a woman named Ninshuba, who has operated the place for over 20 years and who knows essentially every merchant in the western half of Ur. Her tavern occupies the ground floor of a modest two-story building, with a drinking room opening off the street and a smaller back room for private conversations. Inside, the walls are whitewashed and decorated with painted geometric patterns. Low benches line the walls, with cushions provided for the customers to sit on. A row of large ceramic jars sits along one wall, containing the beer at various stages of fermentation. A small hearth at the back is where Ninshuba prepares hot food, mostly grilled fish and vegetables, and flatbread heated on a small clay griddle. And there's always a lingering smell in the air of fermenting grain, roasting fish, and the honey and dates she uses to sweeten some of her specialty beers. Luenlil arrives to find several familiar faces already there. There's Pusarishta, a fellow merchant who deals primarily in wool and textiles, heading north to the cities of Akkad and beyond. There's Iadinam, a copper trader who's been in a long-running dispute with a supplier and who wants advice on how to press his case. There's a scribe named Waradsin, employed by the palace administration, who often comes in the afternoons to hear what the merchants are talking about and to pick up business gossip that might be useful to his employers. And there are several other men Luenlil knows by sight, but not well. They greet each other with the standard Sumerian salutation, which translates roughly as "May your day be favorable," and they call for beer from Ninshuba, who nods to her assistant to fetch a fresh jar. The conversation ranges widely over the next couple of hours. There's news from a caravan that arrived yesterday from the north, reporting that the harvest in the region around Kish has been excellent and that grain prices are likely to drop next month. There's speculation about political tensions between Ur and one of its rival cities, which has been withholding water from a shared canal in what looks like an early warning of trouble. There's gossip about a wealthy merchant's daughter who has apparently run off with a lyre player, causing enormous scandal, and the merchant is now trying to have the man arrested for theft, though there's no evidence of any theft actually occurring. There's laughter about a recent case that came before the court in which a man who had been struck by a donkey in the market tried to sue not the donkey's owner but the animal itself, arguing that it should be executed as a matter of principle. He lost, but the case became a source of amusement throughout the city, and there's serious business too. Pusarishta wants to know if Luenlil would be interested in investing in a joint venture with him to send a shipment of Ur-produced textiles to Mari, a city far to the northwest on the middle Euphrates. Mari was one of the great commercial hubs of the ancient Near East during this period, and its markets welcomed goods from all directions. Luenlil listens carefully to the proposal. The investment would be substantial, the risks are real, and the timeline would take months before returns could be expected. But the potential profits are significant, and Pusarishta has a good track record. Luenlil says he'll consider it and give an answer within a few days, which is the standard polite response for a Sumerian merchant who doesn't want to commit immediately but doesn't want to close the door on the deal either. This kind of afternoon in the tavern was one of the primary engines of the Sumerian economy. It's where deals were made, information circulated, alliances formed, and disputes talked through. It's also where Lu Enlil and his colleagues renewed the social bonds that made them a functioning community of merchants rather than just a collection of individuals pursuing their own interests. In a world without email, without newspapers, without any form of mass communication whatsoever, the tavern was the information network. And Ninshuba, standing behind her beer jars and listening to all of it, was one of the most well-informed people in the city. Meanwhile, back at the house, Jeem Nana and Nintud have set out for their own afternoon engagement. They walk together through the streets, which are now busy again, but not as chaotic as they were in the morning. Jeem Nana is wearing her second-best robe, a garment of fine linen dyed a soft blue with the border embroidered in a pattern of pomegranates. She has a light shawl draped over her hair and shoulders. Nintud is dressed similarly, though her robe is simpler, being still a girl's garment rather than a woman's. A servant walks behind them carrying a small basket of gifts, honey cakes prepared this morning and wrapped in fresh leaves. Their destination is the home of a woman named Armasoon, whose daughter is being married in 3 weeks' time. Armasoon has invited a dozen or so women from allied families to spend the afternoon together, formally reviewing the final arrangements for the wedding, but really using the occasion as an opportunity for the kind of extended social gathering that was one of the primary pleasures of Sumerian women's lives. The house they enter is somewhat larger than Lu Enlil's, its owner being a wealthy livestock dealer. The reception room is spacious, with painted walls, cushioned benches around the perimeter, and low tables laden with food. Dates stuffed with almonds, small cakes made with barley flour, honey and sesame seeds, bowls of yogurt drizzled with more honey, fresh cheese with herbs, grapes brought at considerable expense from the northern hills. And of course wine and beer, the wine reserved for the elder women, the beer for everyone else. The gathering begins with a formal greeting between Armasoon and each of her guests as they arrive, with brief exchanges of courtesies about family news, the health of the children, the state of the household. Jeem Nana and Nintud make their greetings, present their gift of honey cakes, and take places on one of the benches. Nintud is fascinated by this event. She is old enough to be included, but young enough to still be watching and learning rather than fully participating in the adult conversations. And what she is learning, though she may not fully realize it yet, is the whole intricate social world of the women of the Sumerian upper class. Who is related to whom? Whose son is looking for a bride? Whose husband has been advanced or set back in his career? Whose family is rising and whose is falling? All of this information, which is essential to navigating the marriage market and the social hierarchy of the city, is being transmitted here in the tone of voices, the raised eyebrows, the pointed silences, the pointed comments. It is a masterclass in social intelligence, and Nintud is a diligent student. The immediate business of the afternoon is the wedding, and this occupies perhaps the first hour of the conversation. The details are extensive. The list of guests has to be finalized. The menu for the wedding feast has to be settled, with careful attention to the preferences and dietary requirements of the most important attendees. The bride's trousseau has to be reviewed and any last additions decided. The specific ritual elements of the ceremony have to be confirmed with the priest who will officiate. The gifts that the bride will present to the various members of her new husband's family have to be selected and their value confirmed. And the delicate matter of the seating arrangement at the wedding feast, which will require balancing the honor of multiple families whose relative status is not always obvious, has to be negotiated with all the diplomatic care of a peace treaty. Armasoon has drawn up a preliminary seating chart on a wax tablet, and this passes from woman to woman for comment and revision. There are gentle disagreements. There are proposed compromises. There are references to old family disputes that must be handled delicately. And gradually, over the course of the discussion, a consensus emerges. Once the wedding business is settled, the conversation drifts into wider subjects. And this is when the real value of the gathering emerges, at least from Jeem Nana's point of view, because now they can talk about everything else. There is the situation of a mutual friend whose husband has recently died, leaving her with 3 young children and complicated inheritance issues. Several of the women commit to visiting her over the coming weeks. There is the news about the eldest daughter of a prominent family who has been accepted into the temple as a Naditu priestess, which is a religious calling that involved a woman dedicating herself to the god's service without marrying, though the Naditu were allowed to own property and conduct business and lived in a kind of communal house near the temple. It's a respectable option for a daughter whose parents cannot easily marry her off or who chooses that path herself. There is discussion of a new medical practitioner in the city, an Ashapu of considerable reputation, who has been treating a woman's persistent headaches with a combination of herbal preparations and ritual observances, and has apparently been successful. Several women make mental notes of the name, and there is, inevitably, the discussion of politics, because women of the Sumerian upper class were not excluded from politics in any absolute sense. They could not hold formal political office, but they were often extremely well informed about affairs of state, and their opinions carried weight within their families and social circles. The current political concern is the relationship between Ur and its neighbor to the east, the city of Lagash, which has been tense for some months. Border stones marking the traditional division between agricultural lands under the two cities' respective control have been mysteriously moved several times, apparently by farmers loyal to Lagash trying to encroach on Ur territory. The kings of both cities have exchanged formal letters of complaint, mediated by the priesthood of Nipwa, which was the traditional religious center where intercity disputes were often settled. Everyone hopes it can be resolved without war, but the women are realistic. War between city-states was a regular feature of Sumerian life, and their sons and husbands could be called up for military service at any time. Speaking of which, we should probably address Sumerian warfare briefly, because while we're not focused on it, we can't understand daily life without acknowledging its constant presence in the background. The Sumerian city-states fought each other regularly, and they also faced periodic invasions from the mountain peoples to the east and north. Sumerian armies were composed partly of professional palace troops and partly of citizen militias called up when needed. The equipment was different from what we described for Greek hoplites, but not entirely dissimilar in principle. Copper and later bronze helmets, large shields of hide stretched over wooden frames, spears with copper heads, battle axes, and as one of the great Sumerian military innovations, the war chariot. Not the fast, light two-horse chariot of the later Bronze Age Egyptians and Hittites, but a heavier, slower vehicle drawn by 4 onagers, which were a kind of wild ass native to the region, carrying a driver and a spearman. These vehicles appeared on Sumerian battlefields for centuries and are shown on the famous standard of Ur, that mosaic panel found in the royal tombs which depicts on one side scenes of war and on the other scenes of peace and feasting. Battles between Sumerian cities were often smaller than we might imagine, involving perhaps a few thousand men on each side, and they were fought over specific and concrete objectives. Control of a particular canal, ownership of a stretch of border land, redress for some insult or violation. Cities that lost paid tribute submitted to the authority of the winning king or lost specific pieces of territory. They were rarely destroyed outright, because the destruction of a city was seen as a religious catastrophe of enormous seriousness, invoking the anger of the city's patron god and setting a precedent that could be used against you later. Sumerian warfare was, in this sense, relatively contained and conventional. Not gentle, but not the kind of total war that would characterize later ancient empires. For Lu-Enlil's family, the immediate concern about the tensions with Lagash is whether Lu-Enlil himself might be called up for militia service. He served twice as a young man, once in a minor border skirmish that lasted only a few weeks, and once in a more serious campaign that involved a march of nearly 200 kilometers and resulted in an actual battle. He remembers both experiences with mixed feelings. The comradeship was real, and the sense of civic duty was strong, but the reality of ancient warfare, even at its small scale, was terrifying and unpleasant, and he is not eager to repeat it in his 40s. Being now a merchant of some standing, He could probably arrange to send a substitute if it came to it, either a paid replacement or one of his household slaves, though this would carry some social cost. Better to hope the situation resolves itself diplomatically. The women's gathering breaks up in the early evening as the sun is beginning to descend toward the western horizon. Jeem Nana and Nintud walk home in the cooling air, exchanging their impressions of the afternoon. Nintud has questions about several of the women she met and about various things that were said. Her mother answers patiently, using each question as an opportunity to teach her daughter something about the social world she is preparing to enter as an adult. By the time they reach their house, the sun is low and the streets are filling up again with the evening crowd. Merchants returning from their taverns, workers coming home from workshops, priests emerging from the temple for their own evening activities, children being called in from the streets for their supper. Lu Enlil is already home when they arrive. He is in the courtyard, sitting on a cushioned bench, drinking a cup of beer and playing a board game with Erning Gersu, who has returned from the scribal school and as an older son is allowed the privilege of adult company in the evenings. The board game is one of the classic Sumerian pastimes, played on a wooden board with black and white stone pieces, involving both strategy and some element of chance through the throwing of dice made from the knucklebones of sheep. It's an ancestor game of many later Near Eastern board games, and possibly related to backgammon in some distant way, though the exact rules are still debated by modern scholars. Erning Gersu is describing his day at school. His teacher was particularly demanding today. There was a difficult mathematical problem involving the calculation of interest on a loan, which he eventually solved, but only after considerable struggle. The teacher then made him write out a passage from the instructions of Shuruppak, one of the great pieces of Sumerian wisdom literature, as a punishment for having taken too long with the mathematics. This piece, the instructions of Shuruppak, is actually a rather wonderful text, purporting to be the advice given by a legendary king named Shuruppak to his son Ziusudra, who in Sumerian tradition was the flood hero, essentially the equivalent of Noah in the biblical tradition. The advice is a mixture of practical wisdom, moral counsel, and cynical observation about human nature. Do not buy an ass that brays too much. Do not marry a prostitute whose lovers are many. Do not answer your father's words. Do not vouch for a friend, and let no man vouch for you. It's a bracing document, and generations of Sumerian students copied it out as part of their education, which means it shaped the moral sensibility of the entire literate class of the region for over 1,000 years. The family sits down to their evening meal as the sun sets. This is the main meal of the day, and it's more substantial than either breakfast or lunch. Tonight's fare is roast lamb, which the household has prepared for the occasion of Lu Enlil's successful trading news, served with a sauce of onions, garlic, and pomegranate juice reduction. There's a pilaf of barley cooked with dates and pistachios, a dish of fish roe mixed with olive oil and herbs, fresh flatbread, of course, a salad of cucumbers, garlic, and vinegar, and a special dessert that Jeem Nana has personally supervised the preparation of, a sweet made from crushed dates, honey, sesame seeds, and pistachios, formed into small balls and rolled in flour. Beer flows freely, and Lu Enlil has broken out a special jar of imported wine from the northern hills for the adults. The conversation over dinner is warm and relaxed. Family news is exchanged. The children are asked about their days and encouraged to speak. Erning Gersu recites a short piece of poetry he has memorized for school, receiving praise from his parents. Nintud describes some of what she observed at the afternoon gathering, and her mother helps her interpret certain nuances she had missed. Little Enanatum, who has been playing outside all afternoon with his friend, is now sleepy and struggling to stay awake at the table, and eventually a servant takes him off to bed. The rest of the family lingers, enjoying the food and the wine and the last light of the day. As the light fades from the courtyard, the servants bring out oil lamps and place them around the space. These are small clay vessels, shaped a bit like miniature gravy boats, filled with sesame oil and fitted with wicks of twisted linen. They give off a soft, yellow light and a faint smell that becomes almost invisible once you've been in a room with them for a while. Every Sumerian household used these lamps in the evenings, and better households had many of them, providing enough light to read by or to do fine work like embroidery. Lu Enlil's family has perhaps 24 lamps of various sizes, though not all are lit every evening. Tonight, because of the celebratory dinner, they've lit more than usual, and the courtyard has taken on a warm, intimate atmosphere that will be recognizable to anyone who has ever eaten dinner outdoors on a summer evening. After dinner, the family enters what might be called the leisure portion of the day, and this is when the deeper cultural life of Sumer really became visible. Because the Sumerians were, contrary to what you might expect of a civilization so focused on agriculture and commerce, extraordinarily fond of music and poetry and storytelling and games. Erningersu goes upstairs to retrieve a small lyre that belongs to the family, an instrument of considerable beauty with a wooden soundbox inlaid with mother of pearl and a bull's head carving at the top of the frame. It's a scaled-down version of the great lyres used in temple ceremonies, but perfectly playable for domestic music. Erningersu has been learning to play as part of his general education, because a well-educated Sumerian young man was expected to have some musical ability. He tunes the strings, plucks a few experimental notes, and then begins to play a piece he has been working on for weeks. The music of ancient Sumer is one of the great losses of history. We know they had it. We know they took it seriously. We have depictions of musicians on statues and reliefs and mosaics. We have surviving instruments, including the magnificent lyres from the royal tombs of Ur, which were carefully reconstructed after their discovery. We have written references to musical performances at temples, palaces, and homes. And we have some tablets that appear to be actual musical notation from a slightly later period, which modern scholars have partially interpreted and reconstructed. But we have no recordings, no unbroken oral tradition, no way to be certain what these people actually sounded like when they played and sang. Modern reconstructions of Sumerian music are educated guesses, based on the surviving instruments, the notation systems, and the traditional music of the region that may preserve some ancient elements. The results are haunting and strange to modern ears, with modal scales quite different from what we're used to, and rhythmic structures that don't quite match anything in the modern repertoire. Erningersu's piece tonight is a hymn to the moon god Nana, which he has been learning as part of his religious education. His playing is not yet virtuosic, but it's competent and heartfelt, and his family listens attentively as the notes fall softly into the evening air. When he finishes, everyone praises him warmly, and Jeem Nana asks him to play something lighter, something with more of a dance rhythm. He obliges with a piece that is essentially a Sumerian equivalent of a folk song, with a simple melodic line and a lilting rhythm that Nintud recognizes and hums along to. The atmosphere in the courtyard is warm and content. After the music, Lu Enlil begins to tell a story. This is another of the classic Sumerian evening entertainments, and Sumerian storytelling was an art form of considerable sophistication. The greatest of the Sumerian stories, of course, is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which even in its earliest surviving Sumerian form is a remarkable piece of literature and which would be reworked and expanded over centuries into the version we know best today. But there were many other stories too, tales of the gods and their adventures, stories of the great kings of ancient times, fables involving talking animals, ghost stories, love stories, and the whole rich body of what folklorists call the popular tradition, the informal stories that circulated among ordinary people and were passed down through the generations. Tonight, Lu Enlil tells a version of the story of Inanna's descent to the underworld, which was one of the most famous Sumerian myths and which has extraordinary depth and complexity. In this story, the goddess Inanna, who is the goddess of love and war and the patron deity of Uruk, decides to visit her sister Ereshkigal, who rules the land of the dead. She dresses in her finest garments, adorns herself with her most powerful jewels, and descends through the 7 gates of the underworld. At each gate, she is required to give up one of her ornaments or garments until she arrives naked and stripped of her power before her sister's throne. Ereshkigal is not pleased to see her. Inanna is killed. Her body is hung on a hook on the wall, and her father god Enki has to send a rescue party to retrieve her, though even the rescue involves complications and difficult bargains, and the goddess can only return to the world above if she provides a substitute to take her place among the dead. That substitute, in the end, turns out to be her own consort Dumuzi, whom she finds enjoying himself while she has been suffering. This is a story with layers of meaning that Sumerian audiences understood intuitively. It's about the cycles of the seasons, with Inanna's descent representing the death of vegetation and her return representing its rebirth. It's about the relationship between the living and the dead. It's about the nature of divinity itself and the limitations even the gods face. And it's a story about betrayal and consequence, about a queen who returns from death to find her husband unfaithful in her absence and takes her revenge. Lu Enlil tells the story well, embellishing certain scenes and adding little touches of description that make the ancient tale come alive for his listeners. The children are rapt. Even Erningersu, who has heard this story many times before, is drawn into it. The lamps flicker and the shadows dance on the courtyard walls, and for a moment the ordinary world recedes and the mythic world becomes almost tangible. When the story is finished, and the applause and expressions of appreciation have been made, the family begins to prepare for bed. It's now late in the evening, perhaps 3 hours after sunset, and everyone has to be up early tomorrow. Erningersu carefully puts the lyre away in its cushioned wooden case. Jeem Nana directs the servants to clear the remains of the meal and to prepare the sleeping areas. The children are sent to wash before bed, which involves basins of water and small pieces of natural sponge, and for the older ones, a stick chewed at one end to serve as a primitive toothbrush. Sumerian dental care was surprisingly conscientious, and their word for tooth care involved regular cleaning with mixtures of ash and mint and other herbs believed to freshen the breath and preserve the teeth. It didn't always work, and Sumerian skeletons show evidence of considerable dental disease, but the effort was made. The family climbs up to the roof of the house to sleep in the cooler night air, as they have been doing every evening for weeks now during the summer. Sleeping mats and light blankets have been laid out. The children lie down first and are asleep within minutes. Lu Enlil and Jeem Nana talk quietly for a while under the enormous star-filled sky. The stars would have been incredibly bright in ancient Sumer without the light pollution of modern cities, and the summer constellations would have been strikingly clear. The Milky Way would have been a bright band across the sky. The planets would have been visible in ways that most modern city dwellers have never seen. And the Sumerians noticed. They noticed intensely, because Sumer, more than any other early civilization, was where the systematic observation of the heavens began. The Sumerian priests, who eventually developed into the specialized class of astronomers and astrologers, tracked the movements of the sun, moon, planets, and stars with a precision that was extraordinary for their time, and that laid the foundation for all subsequent Western astronomy. They identified the zodiacal constellations. They tracked the phases of the moon. They predicted eclipses. They noticed that certain planets appeared to move in complex patterns against the fixed stars, and they gave those planets the names of gods. Ishtar for the planet we call Venus, Nergal for Mars, Ninurta for Saturn, Marduk for Jupiter, Nabu for Mercury, and they developed the whole framework of astrological interpretation that would later be borrowed by the Greeks and eventually become the astrology that persists in various forms into our own time. Lu Enlil and his wife don't have any particular astronomical purpose in mind tonight. They're just enjoying the sky. But they are aware, in a way that most modern people are not, of the significance of what they're seeing. The moon is currently in its third quarter, which has certain astrological implications for the coming week. Venus is bright in the western sky, which is generally a favorable omen. And Jupiter, the planet of the great god Marduk, is currently rising in a position that the temple astronomers have declared to be auspicious for commercial activities, which pleased Lu Enlil to hear when he learned of it last week. Eventually, they too fall asleep, joining their children under the vast Mesopotamian sky, and the city around them settles into the quiet of the night. Not silent, exactly, because a city of 30,000 people is never truly silent. There's the occasional bark of a dog, the distant voice of a night watchman on his rounds, a baby crying somewhere, a donkey shifting in a stable. the soft sound of the wind through the date palms lining the canals. The temple watchmen change their shifts at midnight, and the deep gong that marks this event echoes softly across the rooftops of the sleeping city. Somewhere in the palace, a scribe is still working by lamplight, finishing a set of accounts that need to be presented to the king in the morning. Somewhere in the temple, the night priests are performing the ritual observances that never stop, because the god must be served through all hours of the day and night, without interruption forever. Somewhere at the docks, the harbour watch is checking that no boats have drifted from their moorings. And somewhere in a small hut near the outer wall, an old woman is dying alone, though her neighbours will find her in the morning and see that she receives proper burial rites so that her soul can pass safely into the underworld. This is the city as it lives and breathes at night, a great organism of thousands of individual lives, each one experiencing its own version of the day just past and preparing unconsciously for the day to come. The Sumerian civilization would continue in this rhythm for another 600 or 700 years after the moment we've been imagining, before eventually giving way to the successor cultures of Babylon and Assyria, which would preserve and transform much of what the Sumerians had created. The Sumerian language would gradually stop being spoken in the streets, though it would remain the language of scholarship and religion for another 1,000 years after that. The great cities would rise and fall and rise again. Ur would be sacked by invaders and rebuilt. Uruk would gradually decline as its irrigation channels silted up. New cities would emerge and eclipse the old ones. The center of civilization in Mesopotamia would shift northward as the southern rivers changed their courses and the southern soils became increasingly salinized. But the cultural DNA that these first city dwellers created would prove astonishingly durable. Cuneiform writing would remain in use for over 3,000 years, until the very last known cuneiform tablet was inscribed in the 1st century of the Common Era, in a small temple in Babylon, where a handful of dying priests were still keeping alive the old traditions after everyone else had forgotten them. The mathematics they invented would provide the foundation for the science of the classical Greek world, and through it, for the mathematics of the Islamic Golden Age, and eventually of the European scientific revolution. Their legal codes would influence every subsequent legal system in the Near East, including the biblical Mosaic Law. Their myths and stories would percolate through the entire ancient Mediterranean world, appearing in disguised form in the Bible, in Greek mythology, in the works of authors as varied as Homer and the writer of the Book of Job. Their astronomical observations would form the basis of Greek astronomy through the transmissions of Chaldean priests. Their 60-based system of counting time and measuring angles is still on the watch on your wrist. And more subtly, the very idea of city life, the idea that thousands of unrelated strangers can live together in a bounded space under a common set of laws and institutions, and produce more collectively than they could individually, is a Sumerian invention that has shaped everything about how humans have organized themselves ever since. When you walk through a modern city and see the great buildings, the commerce, the strangers passing each other in the street, the bureaucratic machinery that keeps it all functioning, the informal networks of neighborhood and market and workplace, you're seeing something that ultimately traces back to Uruk and Ur and Eridu, 5,000 years ago in the muddy floodplain of southern Mesopotamia, where a group of people first figured out how to do this. It wasn't inevitable. It wasn't obvious. It required generations of trial and error and adjustment. And it happened first here, in the villages that grew into the towns that grew into the cities that grew into the world we still live in. The Sumerians themselves had a strong sense that they were living in a special time and place. Their literature is full of references to the greatness of their cities, the wisdom of their institutions, the favor of their gods. They wrote city laments, formal poetic mournings for cities that had been destroyed, expressing a grief that clearly went beyond individual loss into something like civilizational consciousness. When Ur was sacked around 2000 BCE by the Elamites and the Amorites, the resulting lament for Ur is a work of extraordinary emotional power, describing the desolation of the streets, the abandoned temples, the corpses left unburied, the survivors wandering in confusion, and the goddess Ningal weeping for her lost city with a grief so intense that even the reader, 4,000 years later, can feel the weight of it. "Woe to my city, woe to my temple," she cries. "In my city and in my temple, the enemy has multiplied." And yet the city was rebuilt, because that's what humans do. The Sumerians understood something profound about the resilience of urban civilization, which is that as long as some memory of the city survives, some knowledge of how to build canals and organize labor and record transactions and celebrate the gods, the city can be reborn even after catastrophic destruction. They saw this happen repeatedly. Cities fell. Cities rose again. The pattern was clear, and it was consoling in its way, even in the depths of the lamentations for specific losses. I want to end tonight with a specific thought, and it's this. The people we've been imagining in this Sumerian family in Ur 5,000 years ago would have found it entirely impossible to imagine that anyone would ever be interested in the details of their daily lives. They were ordinary people, not kings, not high priests, not great heroes, not participants in famous events, just a merchant, his wife, and their children going through the routines of a summer day in the ancient world. If you had told Lu Enlil that in 5 millennia, tens of thousands of people would sit in front of glowing rectangles and listen to a stranger describe his household, his breakfast, his business meetings, his family dinner, his sleeping arrangements on the roof, he would have thought you were mad or drunk or perhaps possessed by a demon that specialized in ridiculous predictions. But here we are. And the reason we can do this, the reason we can reconstruct these lives in this level of detail, is because the Sumerians decided to write things down. They kept receipts. They preserved contracts. They saved letters. They copied out poems and stories and mathematical exercises and lists of vocabulary and school assignments and legal cases. They didn't do it for us. They did it for themselves, for their own practical and cultural reasons, without any thought of a future audience. But by doing it, they gave us the gift of themselves, preserved in fragments across the millennia, waiting to be reassembled by anyone who cared to look. And when we do look, when we translate their tablets and read their letters and imagine their days, we discover that they were not so different from us. They worried about their children. They liked good food. They enjoyed a drink with their friends after work. They fell in love and got married and had disputes with their in-laws. They dealt with bad customer service. They played board games. They told stories to their families in the evenings. They looked at the stars. They fell asleep and hoped that tomorrow would be as good as today or a bit better. That is the real gift of studying the daily life of any ancient civilization. Not the exotic elements, though those are fascinating too. Not the strange gods or the unfamiliar customs or the alien technologies. But the recognition, at the deepest level, that these were people. People with fears and hopes and appetites and loves and ambitions and disappointments. People who wanted to be understood, even if they didn't know it, and who left behind the traces that would let us understand them if we cared to make the effort. And that, I think, is worth the time we've spent together tonight. Because in understanding them, we understand something important about ourselves, and about what it means to be human, and about how astonishingly deep the roots of our own civilization actually run. 5,000 years is a long time. But it's not so long that we can't reach across it and see, in the fading light of a Mesopotamian evening, a family sitting together in a courtyard, drinking beer, telling stories, laughing at the children, and getting ready for bed under a sky full of stars. If I had been born in a different time, perhaps 5,000 years ago, I would probably be one of those Sumerian merchants, keeping my accounts on clay tablets, arguing with copper suppliers, drinking beer at Ninchuber's tavern in the afternoons, and hoping that my children would have good lives. Instead, I am here, sitting in a comfortable chair, making YouTube videos for you good people about the merchants who might have been my ancient counterparts. It's a strange kind of continuity, but I like to think it's a real one. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. It's been a genuine pleasure spending a bit of time in a Sumerian city with you. If you enjoyed this journey through the daily life of the first city dwellers in human history, please give the video a like, drop a comment about what part surprised you most, share it with a friend who might enjoy it, and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you're interested in joining the ranks of supporters who keep this channel ad and sponsor free, beholden only to our great audience, then you can check out the Patreon membership and merch store donation links in the pinned comment and description. I've got plenty more daily life videos planned for the coming weeks. Ancient Egypt, medieval Constantinople, Viking Scandinavia, Imperial Rome, Han Dynasty China. All the great civilizations of the past and the ordinary people who lived within them. I hope you'll join me for those too. Until next time, my friends. Good night, everyone. Sleep well under whatever sky you happen to be under. And spare a thought, if you would, for those first city dwellers 5,000 years ago who did something no humans had ever done before and thereby made us possible. I will see you next time. Peace.